Okay, folks, just started recording for the Chapter 4 JavaScript lecture. I have my code editor open and I've got the PowerPoint open. Go ahead and go full screen on that. And then tab over to my editor, tab back to the PowerPoint, code editor and PowerPoint on Alt-tab back and forth. So we're good. The good news about Chapter 4 is that the new material is not nearly as broad as the last chapter. And so really the pace slows quite a bit in Chapter 4 as far as the new material goes. Um, and so we're going to be looking at some different JavaScript objects and some of the different methods and properties that belong to them. I think some of this is going to be reviewed because we've definitely done some of this already. Like document get element by ID, we've already done that. Some of the different methods though will be new. For example, on number 6 there, the toFixed method. That's going to be how we round numbers. So we want to like have 2 decimal places. We could take a number and round it to 2 decimal places, so that's good. We'll work with some date objects. Okay, so for the first time, you'll work with a date, time and date. We'll work more with string data. String data can be anything inside of quotes. So any character that you could type at the keyboard is a string. And we'll learn how to work with more with strings. We'll kind of go through this concept of global and local variables, and this number 12, using strict mode in JavaScript, will be new for us. And then we'll also talk about how to do stuff when the page loads with the window on load. Okay, so definitely some new information here, but a little bit of review. And hopefully this is a chance, if you kind of felt like behind a little bit, hopefully this is a chance to maybe play catch up a little bit. Maybe. And so the first, this first slide is just keep in mind that the window object is considered the global object. So you, like window.prompt, but you don't really need the window. You could just say prompt, right? And we covered that before and why that is. Well, another thing that they kind of go through here is this confirm. So let's take a look at the difference between prompt and confirm. So that's a prompt where you get a prompt box, and that's confirm. Although I guess confirm is a little bit more like an alert. So that's an alert, and that's a confirm. Notice the only difference there is that the confirm gives you a cancel button. How is that useful? I mean, you could program against that. You could say if they click the OK button, do something. Else, if they click the cancel button, do something else. So if that would be useful for you, I can't say that we do that a lot in this class. In fact, these kinds of prompts are more annoying than anything else on web pages. Okay, so to get user input, instead of using like prompts and confirms and things like that, I prefer just to use a text box. Okay, but just to show you the confirm method and how it differs from the alert, that's what this first slide is. Okay, nothing big there. Parse int versus parse float. Now, again, because we don't have to type in window.parseFloat, but it does belong to window. Okay, now these are all methods that belong to window, so that's why you can just type in parse float. Okay, let's say let num equals 12.12. Okay, so then let's parse float num. Throw that in an alert. Well, if you parse that to a float, you really don't do much with it other than it's already a float. It can already hold decimals. The difference between parse float and parse int, if you remember, is that parse int chops off the decimals. Okay, so ints are whole numbers, floats can have decimal places. So again, just pointing out that both of these belong to a window. That's why you could just, you have to use the dot operator because again, for the 10th time, it's the global object. Okay, they give some examples there. Okay, but again, these were all examples of the window object, right? So we did things like parse float, we did things like alert, confirm, prompt. And when you've got the parentheses after them, these are all what are called methods of the window object. And you use the terms methods here. Okay. Methods and functions, they're basically the same thing. You're going to hear them used interchangeably all the time. Now the textbook will try and tell you there's a difference. Okay, but in the language, we typically don't use them in any, they mean the same thing. Okay, so if I say method and I say function, I'm kind of talking about the same thing. Okay, the way the textbook differentiates them is that they say that methods belong to objects. In other words, these are methods because they belong to the window object. These are methods of the document object. Okay, so they belong to an object. They're a method. A function then is just something that we create that doesn't belong to an object. It's just a block of code that doesn't belong to an object. It's a call, it's a chunk of code that doesn't belong to an object. Okay, so if these are methods of the window object, again, a little bit of review there. Here are some methods of the document object. Get element by ID. Now, if you don't realize what this method is, let me help. We know what an ID is in HTML, right? We've been doing this since like week 1 of our class with IDs and classes. Within week 1 of this semester, I should say. Okay, we've been putting IDs on things forever. This method, get element by ID, remember in CSS we had selectors? This is our method that selects our HTML. This is a JavaScript selector. And so if you think of a CSS selector, we would do pound result in CSS. Well, in JavaScript, we do document, get element by ID. This is our selector. Now what are we selecting? We're selecting this paragraph. And HTML elements, when you select an HTML element, you then have properties that you can work with, and a common one is inner HTML. And inner HTML is a property of anything that you select in HTML, like a paragraph or a list. Basically, any element that you select has inner HTML. Okay, then we have the assignment operator. So we're selecting our paragraph. We're saying in its HTML, put the words "Hi Mom." Now keep in mind, how is this script going to load? Right now we don't have any functions. So this is going to load top to bottom. The HTML rendering engine, right, is going to load the paragraph. And then it sees there's a script tag, and it lets the JavaScript engine run this code. Because it's not in a function, it just runs it immediately. It kind of, as the page is loading, it's going to run it as the page is loading. Okay? So you might anticipate it puts "Hi Mom" in the paragraph. If we inspect it, this is what inner HTML does. You can see it when you inspect it with Chrome, right? It literally puts the text "Hi Mom" inside of the paragraph. So that's how inner HTML works. Now, because this loads top to bottom, if I were to put this script tag above my paragraph, this script would not know what result is because result has not loaded in memory yet. It's like saying, hey, put something in result, but it doesn't know what result is. So that's one of the reasons why this would break. You can see it says right here, it says cannot set property of inner HTML of null. And if I click on it, it's kind of like barking at this line right here. And it says it doesn't know what the inner HTML of result is yet. Result's not in the memory yet. It's not in the computer's memory. So it says like inner HTML is empty because it doesn't exist. It's null. Okay, so that's why either you have to wait for the page to load and then run your JavaScript, or make sure that your JavaScript is at least loading after the HTML loads. Okay? And we can wait for the HTML to load first and then run our JavaScript. We can definitely do that. Okay? So that's not to say that you can't put JavaScript above HTML. You can. You just have to have a function that waits for the HTML to load first and then runs the JavaScript. Okay? We'll learn how to do that today. We haven't done that yet. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. We also have write and write line. Now, okay, these write and write lines, these are good for like the first week or two of the class, but I want to start moving on because here's what happens. Like, if we start doing something like, again, this write and write line, the difference is write does not cause a line break and write line does cause a line break. So that's a difference between the two functions. But like if we start putting stuff on our page, like we start putting like headings, and we start putting like whatever, footers with paragraphs in them, whatever, this is a footer, paragraph. Okay, and then we do a document.write. What happens is it works, but then hold on, let's do this. Let's put this inside of a function, do something. What happens is that the document.write ends up wanting to write a new document. And so let's put in a little form with an input type of button. On click, we're going to call do something. Missing a quote right here. Okay, let's see here. So we've got our page, we click, and notice it writes a new document. It literally, let me show that again. Instead of appending it to the page, like it did on page load, when you put a document.write on a button click, it just writes to a new document. So a lot of times we don't want to write to a new document. A lot of times we want to put something on the current document. right? In order to put something on a current document, we're probably using getElementById instead. Okay, so this write and write line, I mean, they're good for beginners, but in reality, we're going to kind of stray away from them because we don't want to put something on a new document as much as we want to add to the current document. Okay, so those are methods of the document object. So you can kind of already see there's a window object which has some things in it, some methods in it, and a document object which has some different methods in it. Okay, write and write line. Okay, good. So those, we talked about the window, the global, the document object, not a number. We've tested on not a number. You're familiar with not a number. Not a number, I guess what we didn't really say is that that's on window, right? Because you don't have to say window dot not a number. It's just not a number. You could just call it. Okay, well, we got some new things here. We have a text box object. We haven't talked about a text box object. Well, if you select a text box in the HTML, you have the text box object. So if you select a text box in the HTML, you're working with a text box object. One method is focus. Okay, so let's do that. So let's put a few text box, input type of text. ID is text first name. Input type of text. ID is text last name. Okay, so we don't have any functions here. We just have an empty script tag. Let's go ahead and do a document, getElementById. We're going to select text last name. Dot focus. Because we're selecting a text box, we can put focus on it. And when the page loads, you can see where the focus is. It's on that second text box, which has the ID of last name. Okay, so focus belongs to a text box object, and it does just that. It puts the mouse in that text box. Now there's also properties. We have not talked about any properties yet. But we've used them. The value is a property. Now look, the focus is a method. It has parentheses. Properties have no parentheses. That's the easiest way to remember the difference. Properties, you just put information in a property. You put data in a property. Like if I'm an object, then my properties are my hair color, my height, my weight. These are properties about me as the object. Okay, they're just pieces of information. Methods are behaviors. Methods are blocks of code that run. And when you call a method, you use parentheses. So methods have parentheses. Properties just hold data. So a property is like the value property of a text box. And we've already done this. If I put my last name, so now I can assign, with the assignment operator, a string into the value property of a text box object in our JavaScript. So now when the page loads, it's going to put my last name in there. You can do two things with properties. You can read a property into the JavaScript. You can write a property into the HTML. So when you read, if if I were to say value is my last name. Well, reading is done by saying let last name equals get element by ID text last name dot value. Alert last name. So all I'm doing here is when the page loads, I'm reading the value property, which is I put the value in the HTML. I read it into a JavaScript variable, and I do an alert. So that's how you read a property into a JavaScript variable and put it into an alert. Now let's append last name plus equals comma Evan. Now I'm appending my first name to it, and then I'm going to write a property into the HTML. So the read, the value is done on the right hand side of the equal sign. A write is done with the opposite. Get element by ID, text. I'll put this in my text first name. Text first name dot value equals, I'm going to call this full name because it's a better name. So I start the full name out by reading the last name. I'm going to delete the alert. Okay, I'm reading my last name. I append my first name, and then I put that into the text box. So I read out of this text box. I used the JavaScript to append my first name, and then I wrote it back into the HTML. So there's reading operations. Using the value property, you can read a value, and you can write to a value. These are value properties of a text box object. And then something else you could do is disabled. Well, you can read the status of disabled, or you can write to it. But basically, document.get element by ID. Let's do text last name. And this disabled accepts Boolean values, true or false. And you might guess what this does. It doesn't let me type in this text box anymore. If I disable the text box, I can no longer type in it. So if you're ever on a page and all of a sudden, like, you can't type on a text box, like maybe you could and now you can't, it's probably because they might have disabled it with the JavaScript. Okay, if it was once enabled, then they disable it. Okay, so disabled is true. If it's disabled is false, if disabled is false, then you can type in it, right? Disabled. Okay. So we got the window object, we got the document object, and again, these are case sensitive, so they're lowercase. A text box object is working with an HTML text box. So these are properties and methods of the text box object. Or these are properties, text box object method is focus. So these are all around text box. So these are the three objects we've talked about: window, document, text box. Okay. Another object in JavaScript is the number object. And a method of the number object is toFixed. So this is any variable that holds a number data type can use this method. So let's do let some number equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a number data type. It's not in quotes. Remember, the data types are dates. Well, excuse me. There's numbers, there's booleans, and then there's strings. Right? So this is not a boolean. This is not a string. This is a number because that's all that's on put in it. If we say alert some number to fixed, oops, and then you can put the number of decimal places that you want there, and it will round for us. So it'll be, let's see the output here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Obviously, if let's do this, 1, 2, 5, it rounds up to 1, 3. So to fixed is our rounding operation. All right, and then they just go through and they kind of give some same types of examples like I've given. They also have chaining. And so if you look here, like on number 12, if they create a variable and they call getElementById, that's a method of document. And then they chain the value onto it. Well, you could do it on 2 different lines like they did, or you can do it on 1 line like they did on 12. Okay, we've been chaining. All that is like saying, okay, because we know that what getElementById is returning is a text box, we can use the value property of that text box on the selector getElementById. So we're chaining a property onto a method. And, you know, it's almost intuitive when you use it all together. It's like, well, if you know what the first piece does is it selects the text box, then you know to read the value property out of the text box. Okay, you can also chain a parse float. Let me show you how to chain parse float. Let me just put in a third number here. Input type of text, text number. We'll even say enter a number. This is an ID of text number. Okay, and let's go ahead and code up this do something function. Okay, let number equals document getElementById, the ID of our text box is text number, dot value. Okay, when do we need to parse this to a float? Let me show you again when we need to parse this to a float. Because here, let me do an alert number minus 5. Okay, we got a text box. We're going to put a number in it. We're going to subtract 5 from the number, put in an alert. I got to comment out that other part. Okay, enter a number 10. When we click me, it should say 5. Okay. Why do we need to parse it to a float? what it's reading it is as a string. But when we do subtraction, we don't really have any problems here. The subtraction is working fine. Okay, let me get rid of my other alert here because we're not doing that example anymore. What about multiplication? Take a number, 2 times 5 is 10, 3 times 5 is 15. Multiplication is just fine. We don't need to parse it to a float when we've got multiplication. Division the same way. If I say 15 divided by 5, we're going to get 3. Where's the problem? Oh, this doggone addition. Why is addition the problem? If I say 1 plus 5, we should get 6. Addition is the problem. The JavaScript engine is not smart enough to do addition. Look what it's doing. You see what it's doing? What's that called? It's not addition. What's that called? It's called concatenation. It's concatenating the string with the 5. If I say 12 plus 5, we're getting 125. We're concatenating the 5. Okay? This is where we need to parse float. It's done just like that. Now, when I say 1 plus 5, we're getting 6. It's doing addition. Addition is the problem because the plus symbol is what's called overloaded. The plus symbol has multiple functions depending on what you're doing. If you're doing math, it does addition. If you're using the plus symbol with strings, you're adding the strings together. You're concatenating the strings. So either you're doing math or you're doing concatenation with that plus symbol because it's overloaded. So that's when you got to do parse float. Okay? This is how you parse float in a chain. You select the text box, you read the value out of the text box, and then you put it into a number format by doing a parse float. When you do that, you can now do addition instead of concatenation. If you got that, you're in a good place. If you didn't get that, watch this lecture again. At least that part of the lecture again. Okay? Several examples of chaining. Now, here's their parsing float, and they're doing a toFixed. Here, after the value, we're going to chop off the decimal place to 2 places. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it says toFixed is not a function. So what you have to do is you have to put the toFixed. You got to put the, you have to put toFixed. Why didn't that work? Well, I tried to put the toFixed on the dot value. At that point, we don't have a number. We still have a string. Remember, toFixed belongs to a number object. So value is a string. So you can't put it on value. You have to put it on a number. That's why you put it on the outside of the parenthesis, because it's going to parse it to a float. That's going to be a number. Now we can do toFixed. That's confusing. There you go. Now we're doing concatenation again. So I'm going to do you probably break this up into multiple lines is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the parse float off. And break that into 2 lines. let's see. Okay, get element by ID, parse float, to fixed. There we go. Oddly enough, this, what it did, parse float put it into a number, to fixed put it back into a string. So I had to put it back into a number. That's why this did concatenation. That did concatenation. So that's what was confusing. That's what I found confusing there for a second. But you're just changing between data types too much. Okay, we read the value, we change that value into a number, but then so that we can do to fixed, and then the to fixed puts it back into a string and does concatenation. So if I wanted to do addition again, I had to parse float again back into a number. So we got it to work. It was just kind of a pain. All right, let's look at my recording. We've been going for about 40 minutes. I'm kind of at a decent stopping point. I'm going to pause the recording. You guys take a break. We'll stop the recording here. Pause it. Okay, we are back recording. All right. We left off on the number. Oop, jumped ahead a little bit. Excuse me. No, here we are. Object. All right. The next is a date object. Now, what's different about this date object is, let me pull open everything here. I'm just going to comment out each line that is no longer what we're focused on. What's different about a date object is the syntax. It's kind of similar to an array. When we created an array, we use the new keyword. And so to create an object that already doesn't exist, like we got the document object, we got the window object, you know, numbers, we read them out of text boxes and we store them in numbers. But oftentimes when we create JavaScript objects, there's the new keyword. So this is a date object. And to create the date object, we have the new keyword and then the word date with parentheses after it. And as you guys know, this is a function or a method, I should say. And so let's just see what this looks like if we do an alert date. We got Friday, October 30th, 2020. This is the computer's time, 10:50 Central Daylight Time. So this is what comes from your operating system on your computer, okay? And so, you know, what are the odds that this is the format that you want to display to the user? You might just want the day of Friday, or the month, or the date, or the year. I don't know what you want. What's the format? So that's always the question, is like when you're working with a date, there's a million ways to work with dates. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but you get my point. There's a lot of different ways to work with dates. So there's some methods to really trim down the date object into more useful information. For example, let's do an alert on toDate string. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's going to take that date object and format it differently and just Okay, that's a little better. Friday, October 30th, 2020. Okay, this is really a string, but it's just less information than we had before. If we really want to get the year, get full year, as you can imagine what that's going to do, 2020. Get date. Today's is the 30th, so that's what that does. Get month. Get the number 9. Why is it the number 9? It's October. It's 10. Because it starts at 0. Just to be fun, they start at 0. So, I mean, you can program against that. You can program against the number 9 and, say October, if the number is 9, then we know it's October. Okay, but just realize that's what it does. That's I didn't make it. That's the way it was made. Don't be mad at me. It is what it is. Okay, so let's summarize these. All right, I'm just for notes to date string. Get full year. Get date and get month. By the way, are there more? Yeah. There's more. Get minutes. It is currently 10:54. Okay, so Visual Studio helps us. We type in the word get, you get a whole bunch of things. That's just the ones the book cover. Again, everything that's in there, if you just print out the date, you get a little bit of everything. Sometimes having a string full of everything, like we did, is a little bit much. And so what you want to do is you might want to chop up the string into different pieces. You might want a substring, right? You might want to just a piece of the string, a substring. And so that's date object methods. We're done with the date object. Now let's look at strings. Okay, we're going to use my last name because it is super long and lots of, you can break it up in many ways. That's how you spell my last name. Pronounced Gudmested. I think the stad confuses people. Gudmested. Norwegian. Vikings. Norge people. Okay. Let's do an alert. Last name dot length. Length is a property. It's going to tell you how many characters are in my last name. There's 9 characters in my last name. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That is not starting at 0. It is starting at 1. So we count the length as the number of characters in. So there's a length property. All right, let's look at alert last name to uppercase. See, what happens is people, when they type in their last name, some people might type in all lowercase. Some people will capitalize the first letter. Some people will capitalize all the letters. You know, so it's common to kind of either put it in all caps or put it in all lowercase, you know, just to, you know, maybe every new word is capitalized. There's all sorts of ways to get consistently formatted data. And so you might come across scenarios where you put it to capital. Of course, there's to lowercase as well. So we got to uppercase, to lowercase. These obviously do exactly what they sound like they do. Okay, so let's do index of. Index of the D. Basically, what position is the letter D at? Starting at 0, it's at position 2. The G is at 0, the U is at 1, the D is at 2. So index of tells you in the string, it looks for the letter D and tells you the first letter D. Okay, it's going to always define, index of always returns the first occurrence of that letter. It didn't notice it did not return the last occurrence of that letter. Okay, so that's index of. Let's do comma 1. That didn't make a difference. Comma 2. No, it didn't make a difference. Okay. Position. Okay, let's do a substring. All right, so that's index of. The next method that I want to show is substring. Now, substring can be written in str. So there's sub-str and there's substring. So there's literally two functions for substring, and they work differently. The first one says start at position and go for a length. So sub-str, okay, says start at position 0 and go for 3 characters. That's the first, position 0, and it goes for 3. So start at 0 and go for 3. What about start at 0 and go for 4? What about start at 1 and go for 4? Okay, so that's sub-str. What position do you start at, and for how many characters do you go? Substring says what position do you start at, and what position do you stop at? So I'm going to start at 1, and I'm going to stop at 2. So you just get that one character. You start at 1, you stop before 2. Stop before 3. Start at 0 and stop before 3. Zero, 1, 2. You don't include 3. That's a confusing part of that one. You stop before it. Okay. So these methods, but again, what are we doing here? We're chopping up the string. We start at 3 and we stop before 6. So we get 3, 4, and 5. 3, 4, and 5. Believe it or not, having to chop up strings into smaller strings is a fairly common task. Okay? So that is demonstrating all of those methods that all belong to the string object. So again, a few more. We got substring. We got index of substr. So those are methods of strings. Covered all these fun things, all these terms. Okay. We're on slide 19, and we got really 2 more concepts to go. Okay, 2 more things to go. Maybe 3. Okay. Three more things to go. So we're just covering a lot. I was hopeful this wouldn't be a lot, but it's adding up. Seeming like it's adding up. That's okay. We already covered functions, and we covered functions the easy way by using the keyword function, and we give it an identifier, and this is a block of code that does something. So the way that we've called functions before is we wired up an event handler. So there's 2 parts. This is declaring a function. Declaring a function is kind of what it sounds like it is. You're creating it. Declaring a function is creating a function. But the other part is calling the function. So when you create it, you're not executing it right away. You don't execute it here. This doesn't run right away. It runs when it's called. So once you create, after creating a function, you have to call the function. Calling the function makes it run. Okay, so here we've got this on click. This is an attribute that says do something. Okay. This is like the most basic function that I could make, and this is what we've been doing since chapter 2. We've been making functions like this. Okay, but functions do get more complex, and that's what we're going to start to see here. Okay, so like right now, the function is do something. That something is going to be an alert that says this is something. Okay. This is the easiest way to create a function and call that function. But there are other ways, and they get more complex. Now, functions sometimes have pieces of information that you send to them. Right now, you know, what are you talking about? All right. I could put this variable in here called num. And really this is declaring a variable, var num, but we're just going to leave the var off it for right now. Okay, now this isn't actually going to work. I've created, ooh, I'm surprised that worked. I've created this function that now accepts a piece of information. So watch what happens now if I call do something. I'm going to pass it a number of 5. So now when I declare my function, I'm saying my function has an input. Okay, my function has an input. When you call this function, you're going to send something into that function. So inside the parenthesis, it takes an input. And that input in this case is the number 5. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to alert num. Okay, so when I call the function, I'm going to pass the number 5 into my variable num, and then I'm just going to alert num. See that? So our functions can take inputs. If you have empty parameters, then our function does not have an input. It just runs code. But our functions can take inputs, num. You can call this whatever you want. You can call it number, and then you're going to alert number, and then you're going to pass this value into it. And in fact, I passed it in quotes, but the quotes weren't really needed. You could have left that out, and it figures it out. Okay. Our functions can take 0 inputs. As I demonstrated, a function does not need inputs. Or a function can take multiple inputs. Check this out. I can say number 2. Number 1 and number 2. Separated with commas. Five, comma, 6. And then I will do an alert of number 1 plus number 2. They're just variables. These variables exist inside of this function and nowhere else. We got concatenation going on. Because what are we doing? We're adding strings. They're strings because they're in quotes. If I take them out of quotes, we got addition. Okay, so I just wanted to add that in there, that functions can take inputs. By the way, I like them called inputs because it's a good descriptor of what it is. Okay, that's a good term. Inputs are a good term. However, they're not called inputs. Okay, I call them inputs because that's a good label. Okay, a better, or what the book calls them, are parameters. These are called parameters. Okay, I call them inputs. More descriptively, more accurately, they're called parameters. Slide 23, I jump ahead to slide 23. You now see the syntax of a function. The keyword function, the function name is the identifier. Remember, we're using camel casing for our identifiers. So before we had variables, which are identifiers, and now we're also adding functions, right? Remember, functions and methods are basically the same thing. Okay, methods are tied to objects, functions are not tied to objects. So we're creating the functions. The methods are all the other ones that we just got done covering. Get element by ID and parse float and all this kind of stuff. To fixed. Right? I've already showed you how to call that function. By the way, they call this I say declaring a function. They say function declaration. Tick for tat, potato, potato. Okay? A function with no parameters, a function with a parameter. Remember, the function is the input. Okay. Now, the book does something that is a shortcut, okay? They make this shortcut, and I don't really like this shortcut, okay? This function that they make is a shortcut. They call it the $ function, okay? You will be introduced to the $ function in this chapter. And what the $ function is a shortcut for get element by ID, document.get element by ID. Notice down here, they no longer say document.get element by ID dot email address dot value. They just say $ email address dot value. Okay. By making this $ function that takes one input, takes one parameter, and does a return document.get element by ID, they allow this to be shortcutted, this document get element by ID. I don't like this, okay? Specifically, I don't like this because this $ function is used in jQuery, okay? And if we're writing JavaScript using the $ function and we're using jQuery, these two things conflict. They butt heads and one breaks the other, okay? And so for now, I'm just really, the book uses this $ function. I'm going to try and not worry about it too much in this class because, again, it causes a conflict with jQuery. We could get around it. We could call it something else. The identifier of this function is the $. We could call it function shortcut if we wanted to. And then instead of $, we would say shortcut parentheses email address dot value. Okay, this $ is just the identifier. You could call it something else. You could still write this shortcut method and call it S if you wanted to, or shortcut. All right. Now, the only thing I didn't do in here that the book now shows in this function declaration is that functions are blocks of code that execute, okay? Many times there's several lines of code. There might be 100 lines of JavaScript in here. All right? Occasionally, this function can send information to different parts of the JavaScript. Right now, all of our JavaScript is in one place. So it's like, what do you mean send information to different parts of the JavaScript? We only have one part. So it's really hard to visualize multiple parts of JavaScript, like multiple files, multiple script tags, okay? But you're sending information between locations, in which case, instead of alerting number 1 plus number 2, you could just do some math and then you use the keyword return, okay? And what's going to happen is going to add those two numbers together, send that piece of information to another part of the JavaScript. Okay? Well, right now, the only other part of the JavaScript that we have is here on this onClick. We could, inside of this onClick, we could write some JavaScript in here. This is not really something you would do. So let me make this more real. Okay, I got this other function called another function. It takes no inputs. Okay, when I click my button, I'm going to call another function. I'm going to call this other function down here. This function, the first thing it's going to do is call do something. Let sum equals do something 3 and 4. Because this do something function returns a value of 1 plus 2, you could store the result of that inside of a variable, and then whatever you got to do with that variable. This function returns a value that then you can assign to a JavaScript variable. So 3 plus 4 is 7. We assign 7 into the sum variable, and then we pop up the sum in an alert. So functions can return a value to some other part of the JavaScript. They don't have to. Notice this function doesn't return anything. Okay? So you can return 1 or 0 values. Okay? So if you think of the inputs. Okay. As far as a function, here's a good summary. Functions can take 0 to many inputs. Okay? Functions can take 0 to many inputs. Those inputs are in the parentheses. Okay? And the more technical term is a parameter. Sorry, my docking station glitches a little bit from time to time. That's what it's doing right here. Come on back to me, Doc. Come on back. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties. Bear with me if you're on Discord. Bear with me if you're on Discord. These cables are acting like they're loose. They're not loose. I have them tight. So it must be a failure of the dock itself. I'm kind of in a weird state right now because my equipment is glitching and I just need it to come back. Okay, folks, we are past the technical challenges. Even if you're in class, you're watching my Discord stream. What I was leaving off talking about here was you can have 0 to many inputs, which are your parameters. Okay? Functions can have 0 or 1 output, which is your return statement. Okay? You can have 0 or many inputs, so there's really no limit on the number of inputs. And you can have 0 or 1 output, which is your return statement. Okay, notice this bottom function here does not have a return. Okay, so that's just how you send information to and from a function, because you can have multiple functions and they can all work together and send data back and forth. Okay, when a function has parameters though, you need to send information into those inputs. Now, this is on slide 23. This is how I've been creating a function with you guys for a week or two now. Okay, with what they call a function declaration. There is another way to create a function that is called a function expression. So let me show this. Instead of a function declaration here, as they call it, there is a second way called a function expression to create a function. And this way is done with the keyword let. And the identifier is your function identifier is the same as your variable identifier. So this is just going to be, I think we were calling ours some function, equals, and this is the syntax for a function expression. So again, the function identifier, what the function is named is some function. And we would call that up here by calling some function. And just like the other kinds, just like the other way, you can have inputs and you can have returns. Okay, so here when we click, we're going to call some function. Some function was created down here, just using a different syntax for doing the same thing. If I run this, you could still see that we've created the function and we've called the function. It's just created with a different syntax. All right, I learned this technique later on in my JavaScript journey. So this is actually, this function expression is kind of introduced at an early point for you guys. Okay. You can have parameters, and those parameters would be right here. And then when you pass something into it, same kind of thing here, you pass the value into the input, which is num, and I would say this is something plus 5. Now when I get, you could see I've passed a value into, so you can still have inputs this way using this function expression. Okay, for right now, you know, I don't want to harp too much on the two different methods of creating a function. Just getting you to do either one of them is a good thing for right now. Okay, I do think the book uses more of the second way, this function expression, as opposed to the easier way, which is the function declaration. I think function declarations are easier to start working with. Okay. So we got function declarations like this. We got function expressions like that. They both can take inputs. They can both have outputs. I want to say last topic. Pretty much last topic. No, 2 more topics. Yeah. Okay. Variables hold pieces of information. Variable scope is what does variable scope mean? Variable scope means the parts of the program that can work with the variable. So now that we have functions, as of right now, JavaScript runs either in a function or out of a function, outside a function. Like, we've got all this. This might be a lot to look at. So I'm just going to undo. You can always go back in the video and watch the older stuff. Okay, notice right now I'm just in the script tag. And if I say let number equals 10. So we've got 2 different script tags. One declares the variable, the other one uses the variable. So, but they're both outside of a function. So you would say that here, number is in scope. It's in scope because you can use it. It's the part of the program that can work with the variable, is in scope. All right. Let's put this variable inside of a function. The variable is declared inside of the function, and we're trying to use that variable outside of the function. Doesn't work. It actually says number is not defined. So if you declare a variable using the let keyword inside of a function, and then use that variable outside of the function, number is out of scope. I'm going to do one thing different here. The other way we can create variables is with the keyword var. Let's try using that. We get the same thing. Okay, so let me not make that point. Let's just keep that as let for now. If I were to declare this variable here, assign it in my function, and use it back out of my function. Well, what happened there? Now, here's what happened. It declared it here on line 29. This function never ran. The function doesn't run until you click the button. So what the problem is, line 35 executes when the page loads because it's not inside of a function. So that's why you get undefined as it pops up, because it's not really assigning it until it's in here. What happens here, all right, the point that I need to make is if you declare a variable outside, this is called a global variable. And it can be used, global variables can be used in different parts of the JavaScript. So global variables can be used in different places of the JavaScript. And so they are accessible globally. If you declare it, though, inside, so let's just not declare a global variable. This is known as a local variable. It's only accessible inside of that function. So local variables versus global variables. Global variables are available all through the JavaScript. Local variables are only available inside of that block of code. Available to the block. The block is within the curly braces. Okay. Rule of thumb, local variables are better than global. You want to create your variables locally as opposed to globally. Okay? That's just a general rule of thumb, and the reason for that is that global variables, when you start having bigger programs, global variables can accidentally become modified. You can accidentally change variables. You start having conflicts, and you start doing things on accident, basically. So what's nice about local variables is that you're only working with them inside of a small block of code. They're only in memory in your computer's RAM for a short amount of time, and then they go out of memory. Okay, so local variables better than global variables. Now the book will go through, and they use the keyword var, and they actually make a point here that if you so here's a local variable. It is actually possible to leave the keyword let and var. You can leave this off and just say number equals 10. That actually works. You don't need the keyword let. You don't need the keyword var. Line 32 right here, it actually declares a variable called number. But it makes a global variable called number, not a local variable. So number here would be local. Number here would be global. Okay, remember, we don't like global. So the short thing is don't do that. Always when you declare a variable, use the keyword let. If you're not going to use let, use var, but you should use let. Let is better for making variables block level. Okay? So don't accidentally make global variables by leaving the keyword let or var off. And they go through that over those slides right there. you can see on line 30 here, there's no keyword, there's no var keyword, so text is treated as global. Okay, if you use the keyword use strict will actually cause an error if you do not use the keyword let or the keyword var when you're declaring your variables. So use strict goes up at the top, like right up here, and it goes in quotes. So this is a line that does not allow you to declare variables without the keyword let or without the keyword var. Okay, this would cause an error if you have use strict. Okay, again, best coding practices for variables. Use local variables. I would update slide 33 to say use let keyword to declare all your variables. Use strict, and then declare your variables at the top of your function. So if you've got a function, declare your variables at the top, and then you know what this function does underneath. Okay, now events. Events is the last topic before we're done with this lecture. This has been a long lecture, hour and a half plus some breaks. We are familiar with the on-click event. Like if you look at slide 35, if you look at a button has an on-click event. A window object has an on-load. A link has an on-blur, which means it loses focus. It has an on-focus, which means it gains focus. A text box could have an on-change. A drop-down list can have an on-select. Any HTML element could have an on-click, a double-click, a mouse over, a mouse in, mouse out. These are all JavaScript events. Events are how you run code when the user interacts with the page. So we've been using events with their attribute here. This is how we call something, a function called do something on click. Let me show you another way of calling this function do something on click. Instead of using the HTML attribute, we could use JavaScript to call the function on click. So we're going to target our button using JavaScript. So our button, we're going to give it an ID. btn submit. So we're going to say document.getElementById btn submit dot on click equals do something. And here's what's weird. There's no parentheses on this guy. So before we used an on-click attribute in our HTML to wire up the function, this is another way of what they call taking an event, like a click event, and calling a function when that event occurs. So notice our function just is going to pop up 10. Let's get that to run, and there you go. Now two methods. It seems like we're learning two methods of doing everything. What's the advantage of wiring up an event handler this way? Well, you could say when you click the button under this condition, it calls one function, but if the condition is different, you call a different function. So you can use JavaScript to dynamically call different functions from the same button. And so there actually is a benefit of wiring up your events to your functions this way. Okay, so this is a slightly more beneficial syntax for wiring up your event handlers. Event handlers are just functions that run on an event. That's what an event handler is. Right? We could say, okay, when we double click this text box, text first name. So let's say document.get element by ID text first name dot double click equals